Hello, welcome to CCTV. This is the Counterculture channel, and this is episode 3 from Notes of the Underground, and I'm Lee Harris. Well, I might tell you a little bit about some events that happened in the 60s again, because it's usually seminal and important events that one goes to, or places, or clubs, or musical concerts that inspire us. And in 1963, I made a good friend with a guy called Sid, and through Sid, who was a social worker, I went to Kingsley Hall in the East End, which was a anti-psychiatry, a place where with new counterculture ideas, and was run by R.D. Laing, the existential psychoanalyst, and many colleagues from America. Very interesting group of young psychiatrists who did or psychoanalysts who did a lot to change the mind of people. R.D. Laing later wrote The Divided Self, The Self and Others, Knots, The Politics of Experience, and was a great influence in the 60s, and was as popular in America here as Bob Dylan in his way. He was a very handsome Scotsman and very charismatic. And at Kingsley Hall, poets came, the writer Alexander Trocky, who was a quite interesting man, who was a drug addict, a heroin addict, and a great writer who was in Paris at a certain time. And there was Felix Topolsky, the artist, and we had poetry evenings and Indian dance, and people who were schizophrenic were allowed to go through their madness, you could say, their visions without taking any drugs. And on the top at Kingsley Hall, on the cell right on the roof, in the 30s, Mahatma Gandhi stayed there. So I found myself coming on Sundays with Sid, or different times, or when there were dinner parties, and going to Kingsley Hall. And I really turned on to the teachings of R.D. Laing, Herbert Marcuse, through their Alan Watts. And through Sid in that time, I went to the Royal Albert Hall when I heard the Beat Poets. That was in 1965. And I went to see Martin Luther King, who came to St. Paul's Cathedral. And I went with Sid to see Frank Widekind's Spring Awakening, which was given a special performance at the Royal Court Theatre on a Sunday without decor. It was a band play written in 1891. Which I believe has been revived now as a musical. So I had very interesting counterculture roots. And also at that time, or near that time, in '66, Jim Haynes, who founded the Travis Theatre in Edinburgh, and his cohort, J. Henry Moore, came down from Edinburgh to London to start a multimedia centre, which was called the Arts Laboratory, which came about in 1967 to 69 in Drury Lane. And that was a very powerful influence to a lot of us who were there, because there was films, interesting Andy Warhol films, Bob Dylan films, there were theatre events, there was poetry, and all sorts of celebrity counterculture figures came there. And we got interested in the Living Theatre, which was Julian Beck's theatre group. There were so many avant-garde, interesting things, so that spurred my interest in counterculture. It was a wonderful spawning ground, and full of most interesting people. That's what made the 60s something special, and for me I was young enough to be influenced by those events, and that's part of my counterculture interest. And here I am in Alchemy in the Portobello Road, and we're filming this special edition of Counterculture TV. And I hope you've enjoyed this week's ramble on 2 events. And the afterword, or afterthought, is years later. In the 1990s, I went to Ronnie Lang's memorial service at St. James in Piccadilly Circus. And I also went to the memorial service there for another one of my heroes who died in the late 90s, which was Allen Ginsberg. So there's coming together with lots of interesting people, and one of the more recent counterculture heroes, a hero of his time, my friend Fraser Clark, has recently died, who carried on the counterculture tradition throughout the 90s with wonderful clubs like Megatripolis and the Warp Experience, which were in London, which were altered with colours and lights and electronic, and part of the ecstasy and rave culture with psychedelic trance music. And so the culture has evolved and changed, and I always seem to have been there at the periphery, being a foot soldier of the underground. And I hope you've enjoyed episode 3 of Counterculture TV. Thank you for listening, and peace be to you.